infamous Dave Lewis, Gattaca, with DualSec. So what's the presentation about today, Dave?
Today, the presentation is about trust, and I was promised a jetpack.
Nice. All right. So 30 minutes, you're on stage. Appreciate it. Thanks, buddy.
Excellent. Thank you. And let me just see if I can manage to share my screen successfully. Let's have a look. See if I can pull this off. All right. Da-doom, da-doom.
Beautiful.
And am I seeing slides or my notes?
And now seeing your slides.
Oh, I love it when things work.
I know, it's freaking awesome.
Oh, well, buenos dias, everyone, and welcome to welcome to Tactical Edge. I'm very happy to be able to kick this off from Canada. And you know, it's unfortunate that I can't be there in person, but I'm sincerely hoping that we'll be able to do this sometime soon in person. So today I'm going to be talking about, I was promised a jetpack, and it's about building trust and security. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, we'll get into that. First, a little bit about myself. I have been into, oh, wait, no, that's not me. Nope, that's still not me either. There we go. That's me this long ago. I have been doing security in one form or another now for over 25 years. And it has been a really interesting journey along the way. And I've learned a lot of things in those travels. And I've done everything from being a firewall admin right through to being a CISO for a power company and all points in between. And it's been really interesting to learn about one of the core fundamentals, and that core fundamental is trust, and how trust is really woven into everything that we do from a security perspective. Now, when I was little, one of the really interesting things was in the back of comic books, and I apologize if my Canadian accent is overpowering at times. I'll just say that out front. So when I was young, in the back of comic books, you could order different things. And one of the things that you could order were X-ray vision glasses like this, which were, ostensibly a piece of cardboard stuck to a pair of glasses frames. But, when you're 6 years old, you're like, this is the best thing ever. And you know what, I begged my parents to send away for them, and they wouldn't have it. They said, no, this is not what it appears to be. But I wasn't willing to believe that. I wasn't willing to digest that, that could possibly be something other than it was appearing to be. And that was the joy of being 6. But the funny thing is as we grow older, that doesn't always transition into, a better perspective. A little later on, I was about, 11 years old. I saw another ad in the back of a comic book. You see a thread here. I tend to read a lot of comic books when I was a kid. It was a switchblade comb, and I watched too much Happy Days, and I thought, okay, this is kind of cool. I have to find this thing. So I got an envelope and I filled it up with coins, and I sent it off, and which is, obviously completely unadvisable, but by some absolute miracle, it made it, and they did return with the package, and I did have my switchblade comb, which was confiscated at school no less than 3 times because I thought it was actually a weapon. But again, it was not something it appeared to be. It was, we really were expecting one thing, but it was something else. And this is really where the trust aspect has to kick in, because we have to look at, how are we going to get to a better place from a security perspective? And when we were little, we had promises that were made. We were told, in Popular Mechanics and other sorts of magazines that in the future, we'll all have personal jetpacks and be able to get around that way. And I really held on to that promise as a child. But as we move forward through time, we realize that, security issues are not something we can just hope for a better future, because hope is a good thing to have. But when you're dealing with a security perspective, it is not a game plan. You have to make sure that you are verifying everything that you are dealing with, because bad things are going to happen. And we tend to be, as security practitioners, adversarial in nature in a lot of ways. And this is where we have to take a step back and realize that as security practitioners, we are there as an adult in the room when we're talking in various different IT projects and things to that effect. We have to be there as a guiding voice, as opposed to, that person is going to say, okay, the answer is no before we start talking about anything, which is not going to advance the conversation in any way, shape, or form. We need to actually do better than that. We need to look at how we can get to the future, and how we can actually attain our own jetpacks, as it were, because that hasn't been a thing until recently. So dreams apparently do come true, but I didn't have $250,000 lying around here in Canada that I could spend on one of these things. Also, my wife would never let me. But when we're looking at security as a platform and how we move forward, we have to look at things of how are we going to do a better job of security? How are we going to improve that? And we have our tools of the trade that we have to rely on. And we are like, oh, we have the firewall, we have this, we have that. That is a tool that you're using in order to build your security program, right? It is not a be all end all. Just because you have the scanning software from company X doesn't mean you have a security program. You have to have a program that is built out on trust, because we have to take a step back and realize that the attackers are going to come at you on a consistent basis. They are going to look at ways to compromise your networks, compromise your assets, and steal your information, steal your data. Because what was once a case of attackers being able to compromise a website and then share it on attrition.org or Zone H or AllDOS or one of those mirroring platforms back in the day has now transitioned from the hey, look at me aspect of things to let's be honest, it is really now a huge business. And that's where it all boils down to. We'll hear people talk about it is you're a soldier and it's a cyber war and all this. It's big business. I mean, honestly, it's really is a bit transactional in nature. And this is the thing we have to understand. We have to do a better job because they're going to keep coming at our users. One of the great ways, I say great in that the impact as opposed to, hey, good idea, is dark patterns in user interface design. And what I mean by that is when a somewhat of a negative creates a web page, creates an email, creates a piece of software that looks like it is going to do one particular function, but in effect, it's actually doing something else. You're tricking the user into thinking that there's something else going on. Again, that goes back to the X-ray specs that I was talking about at the beginning. You think you're getting one thing, but in effect, you're really just getting a piece of cardboard and and a little hole in your pocket where your money used to be. And this happens all the time. Now, this is from a few years ago from my friend Cory Doctorow's Twitter account. He posted this particular ad you can see in the slide where there's what appears to be a little bit of a smudge. The really interesting thing is if you go to rub on that particular smudge, it would actually click on the ad and drive revenue for that particular business. And that is not a good way to handle things, right? Because you are eroding the trust of the user. You're tricking them into doing things. So as security practitioners, we have to make sure that we are taking the steps to best secure the end user, because these sort of things are going to continually happen. And the dark patterns that they use are all over the map. There's the bait and switch, click on something thinking you're going to a web page for the latest football scores. And in effect, it flips it and you're now at a phishing website. Or confirm shaming of having a box pop up saying, if you click X, this is what's going to happen. And they go to click X and then says, well, no, if you do that, then this is going to happen. You're basically tricking them, misdirecting those users to think one thing when in fact they're actually doing something else. And we have to be constantly cognizant of this, because when we're dealing with our end users, we have to make sure that we are there to provide them guidance. Because most people, by and large, are not technically savvy. They're not technically adroit. They know how to open their email. They know how to do their spreadsheets, but they don't necessarily understand security. And we have to make sure that we are not vilifying the users, because that will reinforce the negative aspect here. We have to make sure that we are working with the users to build that trust so they understand what can happen. Making sure that when they're looking at applications, teaching them to be able to spot these sort of things of, the wrong colors in a web page. Or, I used to see in the past where at the bottom of a web page, there'd be a huge block of text that would be in the same color as the background in order to trick search engines to rank their website higher. Those sort of things don't work very well now, but this was something that happened a great deal of the time in the past. And this unfortunately creates anxiety with the end user. It makes them doubt everything that they're dealing with online. That's not security. That is, running scared. And the goal here of the attacker is to make them, the end user, think that they're doing things that are to their benefit while causing them, undue harm. Malicious design in applications, web pages, what have you, most times the designer themselves will be the only one that can actually spot the issue. I've seen ads in the past that were in an iframe on a web page that was a legitimate website. It was for a large bank, but the iframe itself, the end user, the end server actually had been compromised. So the frame was displaying an ad that looked legitimate, but was in fact not. We have to make sure that we're not making it more difficult for the users to trust software. So we have to teach them how to spot these things when they can. And if they don't know, to be able to, feel enabled to ask the question. They see something that isn't right, they go, okay, I have to ask the question, rather than just click it, move on with their day. Because fundamentally, we have learned that we can't trust ourselves, because we have an inherent bias within ourselves of how we see things in the universe and the world at large. And it's not just strictly to humans. We have to look at things like algorithms, in the world of big data and dealing with all those different types of processing that we have to see on a daily basis with, machine learning going to AI and all the rest of it. You have to look at the algorithms and how they're collecting their data, because again, bias will exist in an algorithm. Why? Because they're written by humans. So if you have somebody tapping away on their keyboard writing an algorithm, whether or not they're conscious of it, they can be infusing their own bias into that particular algorithm, which can again lead to more problems. Amrit Elzari here, she came up with this wonderful idea of creating a bug bounty for bad algorithms, and I thought this is an absolutely great idea. We have to be able to look at the capabilities of things like algorithms, but we also have to make sure that we're looking at, the incapabilities, the mistakes, the errors that happen, because we can't just trust because it's a machine that is going to be providing us the right information, because the inputs the machine are using are created by humans. And bad things are going to happen. Just because we're in security doesn't mean that we're, really good at it. We've all heard the phrase, the cobbler's children. Everybody else has great shoes, but the cobbler's children don't. Here's an example from a story back in 2011 of a security expert who moved into the developer field thinking they could do it, and they made all of the same mistakes that other developers had done in the past. And this really highlights the issue that we have to make sure that we're constantly vigilant and constantly looking for the potential errors that can occur. Because things like, the attacks, the DDoS, all the rest of it, yes, those are overt actions. But imagine something as small as changing the data or corrupting the data in some sort of fashion. There was a journalist, David Satter, who was targeted by a group, and emails were leaked that were ostensibly made to look like he was working with the CIA, as an example, when in fact that wasn't the case. But the emails have been doctored, and the thing is, perception is 9/10 of reality. And a lot of people believed that this was true until, the thread was pulled and they realized that, the data had in fact been corrupted. And this happens over and over again. For example, here is an example of text that was changed in order to change the tone of a particular article to sway, opinion a different way. And we have to make sure that we are figuring out how to defend against denial of trust attacks. Now, my boss, Wendy Nather, she brought this up as a great example of, trust is something that we have to make sure that we're protecting, because this is actually at the core fundamental of all things in security. And when we're dealing with users in an IT environment, we want to make sure that we're able to foster trust, but not blind trust. We have to be able to enforce that, because we have to be able to trust ourselves and earn that trust from others. Trust is not something that is just freely given. It has to be earned. And how do we earn that trust? We have to earn that trust through building out our honesty, transparency as how systems work, how we operate within our environments, and what the predictability is, so that when a user clicks a button every day when they get to work on their particular application, they know that that is going to provide a function that they have been expecting it to do. And if that is to change from day to day, this really doesn't provide that level of understanding that the capability of the application is such that it is going to perform the way it always does, and that erodes the trust. And as security practitioners, we have to be willing to correct our mistakes, because we make mistakes. I built a career on making mistakes. Thankfully, I learned from them as I went along, but we don't always do so. And we have to make sure that we are also accountable for those mistakes, because as those mistakes happen, we have to be able to take the tip of the sword, put it to our chest and fall forward and own that issue. So how do we get better at building out trust? We have to make sure that we are accountable. Remember when Microsoft came out with their trustworthy computing? That actually worked very well for them over time. So they went from everybody was picking on them to nowadays, you don't hear too many security issues. Sure, they crop up from time to time, but by an order of magnitude, has definitely improved over time. So how do we improve that? Well, we look at something like zero trust. Is that a potential answer? Now, zero trust often gets maligned and looked at in a negative light, but let's just make it a little bit more simple than this. It is really something that is, well, the long and the short of it is yes and no. So zero trust is a framework, or you can look at it as continuous trusted access if zero trust seems like a negative term. The whole point here is to reduce risk in your environment and make sure that you are providing the tools and opportunities for your organization to be safe and secure. Because when we're looking at things, we have to realize, like as Malcolm Gladwell talked about in his book, Talking to Strangers, we are born into this world defaulting to trust. We are looking for food. We are looking for ways to survive. We want to make sure that we are going to flourish, but we don't know to doubt anyone. We just are expecting to be taken care of. Unfortunately, this does not translate into a digital world, and we have to make sure that we have controls in place in order to cover that. Always need to work in the coffee break. So don't trust something simply because it's inside your firewall. We have to make sure that we're doing better than that. Network zone segmentation, multi-factor authentication or biometrics or passwordless to protect the users. And then you want to make sure you're not just trusting access or providing access rather because you just trust them because they work there. You want to verify that they are who they say they are, especially in this current pandemic that we see ourselves in. We are spread to the four winds and people are working remotely. We have to ensure that we are taking the steps to verify who they are and then granting them access into systems. Because erosion of trust is a real thing. We see fake news all the time in every country around the world. We see data misuse of reselling it, profiling it. Every time a website says, oh, use your cell phone number in order to have two-factor authentication. Let's be honest, most of these websites are then taking your phone number and reselling it to other providers so they can have more profiling information to target you for selling things. And then we have to look at the data breaches that happen. Back in 2012, when I started tracking data breaches on my own website, there were quite a few. The biggest one at the time was about 6.5 million records. Flash forward to today in 2021, we see orders of magnitude of billions of records being compromised. So why is this getting worse? We have to make sure that we have strong stewardship in order to protect all of the data. And if we are not doing this and the trust is being eroded, it can become an attack system in of itself. Integrity attacks are a great example of this, corruption of data, accusing folks of a data breach that didn't actually happen, taking data dumps from various different websites, compiling together and saying, oh, this was compromised from your website. This is an erosion of trust because the news may pick it up and run with it and say, oh, this data breach happened, but in fact, it was just a cobbling together of other sites. So this is the kind of thing that we have to make sure that we're protecting, and we have to look at it and in a way of, a triad is a great example. We all love our confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. We can also look at it as protecting the user's devices and applications, because we have an obligation to protect the workplace, the workload, and the workforce of our organization. And if we do a good job of that, it raises all boats on the internet, because our network equals, try that again. Our ecosystem has changed. We have identity access system, network remote access from all over the place, third-party providers. We have to look at all of these different steps. And as we walk through it and look at how do we get to a more mature model, we have to establish trust in the users, gain access to their devices, ensuring that trustworthiness of the device. You don't want to have somebody with a Windows ME laptop trying to plug into your network. And oddly enough, that still sort of thing happens every once in a while. I had a story about that a couple months ago, another story for another time. You want to make sure you have policies that apply to the right people. So if you have somebody in finance that's trying to do changes on a back-end server, that shouldn't happen. So having a policy applied to them is a good way to make sure that they only have access to what they actually need in order to get their job done. We have to enable them to get their job done and not mess with anything else. And as you go through this, you get to a zero trust framework. This framework will allow you to operate within in a safe and secure manner by reducing risk in the organization. You want to verify your users, you want to verify their devices, and protect all the applications. So for example, you don't want me sitting at Tim Hortons here in Toronto, Canada, accessing your email system in Colombia when I'd have no business doing that, but I did find a sticky note stuck to somebody's laptop in an airport lounge. I've heard of these things. I'm sure I'll see them again someday. Whereas the username and password, and that is not enough to protect you. A password is ostensibly a house key. And if you put that house key under your doormat, and because you know your kid's going to be home from school before you are, the attackers know this too. And the same sort of thing with passwords. It doesn't mean that the person coming through in your application is the one that's supposed to be there. So multi-factor authentication, biometrics, or passwordless in the future, all of these are better ways to authenticate your users. Because the attackers, if they have a username and password, they can just get in. But we can limit that by making sure they have another factor or a trusted device. So if they have, not have the ability to get your multi-factor authentication piece, they can't get in. The username and password might get published online, but honestly, to be fair, that is just going to be a reputational risk. And yes, it hurts, but it's way better than them getting in. You want to make sure the devices you have for your network are protected, because you don't want to have them, working from home, inadvertently introducing problems into your environment simply because the system isn't patched to current or N-1. And as I said before, workplace, workload, and workforce. All of the different aspects of your business can fall into one of these buckets. So make sure that you're enforcing your user trust. And you want to go through and look at your environment and see what you have. It's amazing how often that when people scan their networks, they're like, I didn't know that was there. You want to be able to have the understanding of what is trusted in your environment. And if something is introduced in your environment you've never seen before, to be able to look at it and say, okay, that's not right, and be able to contain it. So you don't have people like me using an old Gen 1 Xbox to VPN into the organization, check his email. I've done that in the past at a previous job, and they were not too happy about it. But it was more of a case of, I was actually shocked that there was no controls in place to mitigate that. And I was able to remedy that the next week when I got back to work. But these are the kind of things that happen. A lot of time data breaches that happen are the whoops factor. Something that was inadvertently introduced into the environment, as opposed to a furry tooth hacker sitting in their basement trying to compromise the network. You want to make sure the trustworthiness of those devices that's absolutely key. So having controls in place in order to do that, as part of a zero trust framework, you want to have posture assessments for your hardware, so that when somebody is working from home or in the future working on the road, whatever it happens to be, when they VPN in or they connect to their applications, however you have it set up for your environment, that they are patched to current or N-1, or they have the ability to remedy that themselves. In the past, I would be traveling on the road and it would say, you haven't patched your browser in X number of days. You can't access your resources until this is remedied. Click this button and walk through these steps. Great. Got it fixed, and I was able to get back on to working. I didn't have to open a trouble ticket. I didn't have to try and fumble around saying, I can't get in. There was the ability to, by enabling the end user to fix it, they could move forward and get their job done. The other piece too we have to constantly be aware of is the security debt in our environment. We have applications that are not patched. We have systems that are not patched. We have things to that effect that constantly come up. We have to always be cognizant of that, because every environment I've ever worked at in the past before I moved into the vendor space, and that was 20 years of different organizations, there was always that one beige desktop that was sitting there running mission critical code in the production environment that was written by a summer student, and nobody knew how to port it off that. Now, that's a real and present danger. It introduces an attack point that attackers can leverage, or for example, something could potentially go wrong that has nothing to do with an attacker. It's the whoops factor of it interacting with another application, and then all of a sudden you have systems going down. So security debt is definitely something that has to have a wider conversation going forward, because every organization that's older than 2 weeks has some level of security debt. And this is technical debt that has manifested as a security issue over time. You want to be able to have adaptive policies to protect your users, protect your environment, so that if you have Dave in Canada working on a particular application in your app dev group, that you make sure that I only have access to those resources I need. Or if you have somebody that is on the road and they're overseas, you have a policy that says, okay, they can only access these particular applications, or if they're on their personal device, they can only check their email. Whatever your risk profile is, and that's exactly what I want to hammer home here, is your risk appetite for your organization is the part that you have to be cognizant of, and have some way to manage exceptions as well. Those policies can be all sorts of different things. This really boils down to what your requirements in your organization are. What level of hygiene are you comfortable with? What grace periods for locking people out are you good with? Are you worried about IP addresses coming from Canada? Not a bad thing to be worried about. And you want to make sure that all the applications that you need in order to keep the lights on in your business are safe and secure, and you are protected, because attackers are going to go after your applications no matter where they are. But when you have them in a cloud environment, if they are not properly protected, they can be accessed. So if you're basing things on username and password, you really are doing yourself a disservice, because the attacker can use usernames and passwords from other compromised sites to try and gain further access into your system. So this is where something like multi-factor authentication, biometrics, or passwordless, which is a great example to look at, we can look at ways to improve security long-term. And as we do that, we realize that we're getting to that place where we're almost ready to lift off and get to a better security program, because we've removed a huge Achilles heel for most organizations. We have to understand that trust is binary. It's not permanent. We have to constantly look at the ephemeral nature of trust. And, do you trust a person for how long, for what applications they can access, what conditions you have to satisfy in order to, get things done? It's all about enabling the business. Security is not about being a limiting factor. We have to make sure that we understand that what happens to a community without trust, what happens to a society without trust. The community breaks down, the society breaks down. Trust is a fundamental element of any security program. And we have to make sure that we're earning that trust with honesty, transparency, predictability, capability, the willingness to correct the mistakes that we made, and having accountability. We need to reinforce that trust with prevention, detection, and correction, constantly going through and verifying, because the trustworthiness of the data and systems can't be separated from the people that you deem trustworthy. You have to make sure that you're verifying all three of these independent items, because let's be honest, mistakes are going to happen. But I see a much brighter future, and I believe very much that we are going to get that jetpack, and I believe that we are going to get to a better place from a security perspective, and I believe in all of you. And I really thank you all for your time today. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email. There's my email address. As well, you can also hit me up on Twitter. I'm always up for a conversation and a coffee.